Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer from the Department of Sociology, and I host this program. With me today are our two regular viewmeisters. On the far right over here is Regena Nelson. Regena's in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Educational Studies in the College of Education and Human Development at Western Michigan University. And Don Cooney is in the School of Social Work at Western, and Don also is a Kalamazoo City Commissioner. And with us are two guests who have been on the program many, many times. Denise Keele, of course, was a regular panelist with us at one point before she departed for her current job. Denise formerly was in the Department of Political Science at Western Michigan University, and now she's the Executive Director of the Michigan Climate Action Network. MICAN.
There you go.
MICAN?
MICAN.
MICAN? Yeah, okay. And also back with us is John Clark. John is the Chair and Professor of Political Science at Western Michigan University, and we've had him on the program a number of different times to talk about politics and electoral issues, so welcome back, John.
Thank you.
Glad to have you. So I wanted to let everybody know that this particular edition of Critical Issues is also part of the Climate Emergency Spring into Action series at Western Michigan University this semester. This is a series of events that have been organized by the WMU Climate Working Group, Climate Change Working Group. And I know that there's going to be a special watch party to focus on what we say today. We're going to talk more broadly about the election, of course, but they're interested in particular, how the election might also play on issues concerning climate change and the environment as well. All right, well, it's Biden versus Trump again, right? John, how did we get here?
You know, it's the rematch that almost nobody wanted.
Nobody wanted.
And maybe nobody wanted. It's quite common in American politics when there's an incumbent president running for re-election that they get their party's nomination. They don't necessarily win the general election, but they get their party's nomination. There have been a few instances, but you have to go way back to find somebody that was defeated in the normal nomination process. Lyndon Johnson sort of took himself out of that process, but having an incumbent lose the nomination, this doesn't happen. In this election cycle, we really kind of have two incumbents. We've got, of course, the current incumbent, Joe Biden, largely unchallenged for the Democratic nomination, and then his predecessor, of course, Donald Trump, who was challenged for the Republican nomination. But it was difficult for any of those challengers to gain much traction, and here we are in the middle of March, and it's already been decided for a long time, quite frankly.
Right, the writing was on the wall early on this year. Yeah.
You know, I think on the Republican side, there was at least a window for a serious, more serious challenge to Donald Trump for the Republican nomination. There were certainly enough candidates that were trying to gain some traction, trying to be that alternative. And most of them got in the race before it was clear that either Trump would get into the race, or if he was in the race, whether or not the damage from the circus that surrounds him would make him less viable for the nomination. If those folks, as they dropped out one at a time, had said, look, Donald Trump's not the guy, we need to support somebody else, there might have been enough of a groundswell to at least take this contest a lot further. Instead, with the exception of Chris Christie, when they dropped out of the race, what did they do? They endorsed the former president for the nomination. As a result, you know, we need to counter Trump for the nomination. The Republicans needed to consolidate around a single alternative, and they simply didn't do that.
Right.
And so here we are, as of this past Tuesday when we're taping. Both Biden and Trump have enough delegates to guarantee their nomination on the first ballot at the convention, and essentially all of the opposition is out of the race in both parties.
Denise, how do you see the upcoming?
Wow, yeah, great job, John. And you know, I got to tell you, out there, I work with a lot of young people, a lot of folks in climate and environment, and they're not too excited about this repeat match. And as John says, to have two incumbents is so unusual. And I look back at the history too. When's the last time President Grover Cleveland? You got to go back to the interrupted terms like that. Trump
Don, tell us about
Grover.
I was a teenager at the time.
So it's been really interesting. As John knows, elections are always about turnout, right? That is the fundamental factor as political scientists that we always look at. And we see Trump with that continued base, that continued turnout. It hasn't moved in the many years that we've been talking about him as a candidate and as a president. Whereas Biden's support is seemingly diminishing in some very key sectors in a very purple state like Michigan. And so I think we have a lot to be concerned about as we go into this electoral season, and that there's a lot of work that both campaigns are going to need to do in this state. And it's going to be very difficult to continue to get the support out there, especially on the Democratic side, I think.
You know, I think I agree with what Denise said, but the one additional comment I would make is that Trump has vulnerabilities too,
Yeah.
and particularly as his legal battles continue. The election is going to be about the candidates on the ballot. And so as a Republican, you may not want Donald Trump. He may not be your first choice, but your second and third and fourth choices may not be on the ballot. As a Democrat, Joe Biden may not be your first choice, but your other choices may not be on the ballot. And so it comes down to, is it this person or is it that person? And I think that in both parties, there are going to be a significant number of people who don't really like their party's nominee, but they're going to hold their nose and they're going to cast a ballot accordingly. But the turnout is the key, right? You got to get them to the polls to cast the ballot.
That's right.
And that's where both sides are already paying attention to what turnout is going to look like in November. There's not a lot of voters out there that don't have opinions about Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And so it's more about convincing your core supporters and then your periphery supporters to turn out and actually vote. And that, of course, is going to affect other races up and down the ticket. Here in Michigan, we've got a United States Senate race. The entire House of Representatives is up for election. There are some significant races down ticket in a number of states that actually might sort of drive turnout that affects the presidential race. Usually we see it the other way. The presidential race drives turnout, and candidates below that are either the beneficiaries or hurt by the differential turnout. This time it might actually be the reverse, that those lower ticket races get people to the polls. And once those people are there, if they vote in the presidential election, it might have significant impact.
So, John, what about the Gaza situation? I mean, I think this is different in a lot of ways. I mean, people are saying, I have family. He's killing my family. And I'm not going to forget that. Once it comes, there is a movement now, abandon Biden. So how do you think that's going to affect things?
Yeah, you know, I think the abandoned Biden movement actually was sort of the first one, and the second one was that we want to send him a message.
Yes.
We're not going to abandon him, but we want to send him a message. And I think that by voting uncommitted in the Democratic primary to demonstrate concern. Here in Michigan, there's a lot of voters that voted that way in the Democratic primary. As a proportion of voters who regularly vote uncommitted, not that much different. But in terms of the total number, it was fairly significant. And now we're seeing that spread somewhat to other states as well. For Palestinian Americans in Michigan, many of whom do have family and relatives or know the situation in the Middle East very dearly and very desperately, they're not happy with Joe Biden. Many of them see Joe Biden as Benjamin Netanyahu's best friend. The person who doesn't see Joe Biden as Benjamin Netanyahu's best friend is Benjamin Netanyahu, who feels like the United States is really putting the heat on him and on his government. And just yesterday, Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate, said, "Look, Netanyahu is the biggest obstacle to peace in the Middle East." So it's not as though the Democratic Party generally, it's not even as though the Biden administration is with the Israeli government on this issue. But from the perspective of many progressives in the United States, they're too close. At the end of the day, though, in November, it's going to be a question of, are Joe Biden's policies better for the Palestinian people and going to bring us to peace in the Middle East, or are Donald Trump's policies going to bring us to peace in the Middle East? That's why I think this movement to encourage people to vote uncommitted but not to abandon Joe Biden is starting to get some traction. They want to send a signal, they want to send a message, they want to say we're not happy with these policies. But at the end of the day, in November, when it comes down to the binary choice, for all intents and purposes, between a Biden and a Trump, whose policies are going to be better for those loved ones that you still have in the Middle East? Whose policies are going to be better for eventual peace in the Middle East? That's a very different kind of question, I think, for voters to answer.
Yeah. And even though we've seen uncommitted votes in the past, this one is a little unique that it's been a true campaign around a leverage issue, right? When better to ask your candidate to make a stand when they're asking for your vote, right?
Yes.
And that's what we're all out there doing with voter guides, and Legal One Voters has done so impeccably for so many years. And I do think there is a real concern out there that, as John knows, normally folks drop off the ballot down ballot, but we're still hearing lots of folks who, I think those voters will end up voting for Biden, but there are going to be a lot of folks who vote the down races and don't circle a box for president. And that's the turnout that I think a lot of us are really worried about here in Michigan.
And of course, Michigan is for all intents and purposes a 50-50 state.
That's right.
There are folks who have the mistaken notion that it moved heavily in a Democratic direction because Democrats were consistently winning presidential elections and many statewide elections, but by very narrow margins. And so the swing that we've seen, even from Obama to Trump to Biden as the winners in 2012, 2016, and 2020, it's not been a huge swing of votes.
No,
right.
It's been a very narrow, and there are a number of states like Michigan that are in that mix. And as Denise has pointed out, turnout is going to be the key. Which candidate is able to motivate their supporters to show up and to cast a ballot? Trump, we know, has this base that is solidly behind him. But that's not the entire Republican Party.
Right.
Biden was sort of the consensus candidate in 2020, so someone who could unite the party and provide the best opposition to Donald Trump. He wasn't most people's first choice in 2020. He's not a lot of people's first choice in 2024. So these aren't the candidates that are best positioned to sort of go out there and change the electorate in a positive way for their parties. But they've each got to find a way to get voters to show up on election day and cast ballots.
So we saw in the midterm elections, one way that we got voters out was around reproductive rights. What do you see in this election? Will that drive voters out and have the same impact that we hope that it will?
Yeah, Democrats really hope so, and we've seen Vice President Harris on the campaign trail talking a lot about reproductive rights. There are states like Michigan where we've sort of addressed that at the state level. And so it could very well be the case that for some folks in Michigan, it's like, well, that doesn't really affect us. That doesn't matter. We've already addressed it. No big deal. But of course, we live in a federal system. We've got the national government, we've got state governments. The state of Michigan can address that. The national government could change that, either Supreme Court by some additional action to what we've already seen, or potentially an act of Congress signed into law by a president. That makes reproductive rights still significant. And of course, what we've seen recently in Alabama, and before that, what we've seen in a number of states, these things matter, and for Democrats at least. They hope that that's something that voters are going to pay attention to, and there's at least some polling evidence that that's an issue that's going to motivate college-educated voters, especially women, and especially moderates that live in the suburb that have traditionally thought of themselves as Republicans, but don't see themselves in Donald Trump's Republican Party. And so if Democrats can reach out to those folks, that creates the potential, at least, for some increased Democratic margins, again, in places like Michigan, where suburban Detroit and the Grand Rapids area, in places like North Carolina, in the Research Triangle, in the Charlotte area, where you've got a lot of folks that live in the suburbs now that don't necessarily think of themselves as MAGA Republicans, even if they think of themselves as Republicans.
Right.
How does the climate issue work in here? We know that the reproductive rights issue motivated a lot of people to come out. We also know that Gaza has turned off a lot of young people.
That's right.
So I mean, there's such a clear difference between the candidates on the climate. I mean, Donald Trump, I mean, we have his million statements of denial over the years. We've got a track record from his first term where he demolished everything Obama had done on the climate, withdrew from the Paris Agreement, and continues to take an extreme position on the climate. We know that Biden has probably the best record of any administration over the years in dealing with the climate. And this is an issue that concerns young people dearly. Could that be a motivator to get some of those young people who may be disillusioned about Gaza, but see climate as an issue? Well, Denise, I'll let you answer this first, then we'll go to John.
She's the expert on
because this is your territory. This is your day-to-day work. Do you see this as an issue that could really overcome some of the other obstacles that Biden is facing?
Yes and no, unfortunately. It is absolutely an issue that is out there that young people, but the caveat when you're a campaign worker is young people also still vote at the least rate, right? I mean, it was a huge turnout in 2020 and in 2022. The highest youth turnout ever, hit 38% here in Michigan. So that tells you a little something about, likely voters and where campaigns are also headed. But of course, that's what we hear from anyone under about 40 is climate, environment. And of course, they all see Trump and see the horrible policies there, withdrawing out of the Paris Agreement, that is not going to be their candidate, right? They're not going to vote for that. But what they're urging Biden to do, and much like the Gaza uncommitted piece, is we still have to go further. And they're still seeing, these are voters who are really want to see more dramatic and urgent action, and what we're seeing is more investments, right? The Inflation Reduction Act is an incentive policy. We still haven't seen that money in Michigan, for example, right? It's going to be another year before we see that in districts, right? Making rebates happen and weatherization happen. And so people aren't feeling the effects, I think, of that policy in their pocketbooks right now, and that's going to make a big difference. And the young people aren't seeing it moving far enough and fast enough. And a good example would be the SEC put out a rule just last week to say, it was supposed to say it's going to be mandatory for companies to report on their climate risks within their financial portfolio. Of course, that got watered down. It's now voluntary, and people see that and they say, well, yeah, you're doing something, and we can call that historic. But the caveat is we call that historic because we've not done anything on this issue for the 50 years that we have known that it has existed. So, I hear all the time, well, pretty much anything would be historic, Denise, at this point, and they're right. And so it's with a real cynicism, I have to say, that folks are looking at the Biden campaign and saying, yes, that's our only choice, and it's not good enough. And that's why I do still worry that they're going to drop off and just not circle any bubble at the top, because they don't see it going far enough and fast enough yet.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and this is where that whole idea of turnout comes into play. It seems as though there are an awful lot of young voters who the only old folks that they're willing to listen to are Bernie Sanders and Don Cooney.
Yes.
And they don't really care much about anybody else that might be talking to them about these important issues. We know that on these issues, younger voters tend to align themselves with the Democratic Party. The question is, do they know that? And does that matter to them? If they think that neither of these old guys is going to do anything about the issues that I care about because they're both old and they don't understand, then why should I vote? From their perspective, they're two peas in a pod. From our perspective, as close observers of politics, they're worlds apart. But how do you convince folks who are not likely to pay attention in the first place, least likely to pay attention in the first place, as a general category of voters? How do you convince them that these are issues that do matter to them, and that there is a difference between the candidates on these important issues? And that, again, it's a binary choice, right? Yes, there are other options, but the only two candidates who can win are the Democratic nominee and the Republican nominee. And you can cast a vote for somebody else that might be closer in line with your best first choice, right? With your personal preferences. But if that candidate's not going to win, and a candidate that is, from your perspective, sort of the worst alternative is the beneficiary, is that a smart strategy?
Yeah.
And we'll see.
And there's one other piece on turnout that I'd like to share that I don't know that folks are familiar with. And there's two schools of thought when your opposition is running a campaign. One, you never even talk about it, but I'm going to break that rule. So if you're not familiar, Michigan did pass some climate and clean energy policy last fall. And sort of the same situation, a lot of amazing pieces. A lot of folks like me think it still doesn't go far enough. And one of those pieces is to move the control of renewable energy, large projects, that siting control to our Michigan Public Service Commission. And that has become a drumbeat issue for conservatives across the state of a loss of local control of decisions in communities. Now, that's not actually what the law does. Let me set the record straight right here. There, of course, is still local community input up and until through the whole process. At the end of it, there is an ability for a developer to appeal to the state and say, hey, I'm getting blocked here from a renewable energy project that really should go forward, but there's some vocal minority who, right, is a climate denier, and they're really stopping this. And so that's why the law exists. But there is right now Citizens for Local Choice, of a ballot initiative that is gaining traction and signatures. The Farm Bureau, for instance, just endorsed this campaign, so that tells us there's some weight and some money behind it that will drive some of that turnout in the MAGA crowd and in the local crowd along that side too. And so from my perch, we're really trying to figure out how do we message around that? Do you continue to bring it up and shoot it down? What do we really do? And of course, they have till June to gather those signatures to see if that will be a ballot initiative that will affect this turnout so more. So stay tuned on those pieces as well.
Yeah, I just think that it's not over. I mean, there's things that can be done
Absolutely.
between now and the election. On the Gaza thing, too.
Yes.
I think there are some moves that could bring people back. But those moves have to be made.
So President Biden, you could shut down Line 5 right now and win about 100,000 youth voters in Michigan.
That's a great one. Yeah. How about, so this connection between, clean energy and jobs, and the economy is a concern, right?
Yes.
Even though all the indicators are showing that the economy is doing well, I think people still feel like because of inflation, maybe their wages haven't gone up, that they're struggling. So can this be something that if people can see that connection, that would also drive them out towards a candidate that's supporting that?
Yes, and that's why you're smart and on this panel, because that's exactly what folks like us need to be doing, right? Is showing how, especially those climate investments from the CHIPS Act and Science Act, from the Inflation Reduction Act, trying to make that connection and saying this is what is building those projects in your community. And it's just taken a while for that money to even be available and get rolled out. So it's hard to find those stories to be able to really showcase that. And I really did love what Biden said. I mean, his State of the Union speech was fantastic, right? Like that was amazing, right? If we can do that, if he can do that a few more times, I think that will go a really long way. But one of his great, ad lib remarks was, I guess you still like that money in your district, even if you didn't vote for it, right? And I think those are the kinds of campaign issues and stories that folks like me need to be out there supporting and saying, this is how it does impact that pocketbook. But folks are still feeling it, right, on inflation, and it hasn't quite caught up. That the economy, by any measure, is doing fantastic. And Biden gets a lot of credit. He should get a lot of credit for it, and he just doesn't, right? Yeah.
So I think there's a general feeling that we're not doing well. For example, homelessness around the country, terrible. And the federal government, the only ones that really have the resources to deal with that are the federal government. And they have not acted on that. What's happening in the schools? Kids not coming back to schools. And there seems to be, okay, well, we'll deal with that later. But I think a lot of people are feeling those kinds of things. The superintendent of schools, looking at what's happened in Kalamazoo, says, why aren't people enraged? And I don't see a response coming from the government on those things. I think that has to happen if we're going to get people in the Biden campaign.
So will Biden be willing to push those policies a little probably towards the progressive end if they want to drive turnout is the kind of current calculus, right?
Yeah.
And so far what we're seeing is the answer to that is no. It is staying very moderate, right, with this SEC rule. For instance, the big carbon pollution rule is supposed to be coming out of the EPA. Well, it's supposed to have been coming for the last year or so. Timing is everything in politics, and we were just told it's going to be bifurcated, going to be split in two, so that we don't have to hit coal plants until after the election. That's exactly the kind of moderate stuff that these voters are saying. Go for it.
Yeah.
If you want us, go. You got to go for it. We want to use our leverage as a voter now to make these bolder decisions, but we know what might win in a general, right? That's what these campaigns are really balancing in all of these key swing states.
Right.
I think it's the case with Joe Biden as a politician. He's built a career on getting things done.
That's right.
Yes.
On not, this is my dream of something that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
Instead of, okay, what can we do to achieve that dream? And if the sort of the first choice final outcome isn't achievable, what can we do to make progress toward it?
Yeah.
And we're seeing that in his administration, right? Very pragmatic in lots of ways that don't make a lot of people happy, quite frankly. But they're moving the ball, and moving the ball, and moving the ball, and moving the ball. And, some baseball fans love the home run. They love to go to a game where it's, the score is 15-13.
3-run homer.
And there are other baseball fans who like the idea of a pitcher's duel where every single pitch is so important. I'm doing this just for you. Maybe not have the excitement.
Right.
But my gosh, those can be exciting games. And my gosh, if you're going to be successful, you got to throw strikes and you got to get batters out.
And especially if you're the inside baseball person, right?
Exactly.
Really like that.
And if you're the person who pays close attention to politics, you see all of this action. I mean, one of the most amazing things that we saw in the first 2 years of the Biden administration was the fact that with only the narrowest of margins in the House and the Senate, they got a remarkable set of accomplishments.
Yeah.
We've never seen anything like that. Talk about historic. I mean, that truly was historic. They're getting very little credit for that.
Yep.
Right.
And instead, people are saying, yes, but. Yes, but. Yes, we've had, months and months and months of job improvement. But, yes, inflation's coming down and we didn't have a recession.
Right.
But, and so it's, folks that want more, that's not really the way Biden, as a politician, has operated throughout his career. It's not to say he doesn't have dreams and goals and whatever else, but his focus traditionally has been much more pragmatic, which is why he was such a tremendous asset as vice president in the Obama administration, because he was the one who could go down to Capitol Hill and craft a deal. He was the one who could say, okay, this is the president's goal, now let's figure out what we can do to move as close as we can to that goal. We may not get there, but what can we do to move the country in that direction, to improve the lives of Americans? There's something to be said for that, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Right.
But it doesn't make everybody happy.
Nope.
But I think it's important, as he did in his State of the Union speech, to show that he's on the side of people that want to move in that direction.
Yes.
I think he has to do a lot more of that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Do you think the Biden administration or some of its supporters are kind of counting on the lesser of two evils as a bottom line here? Okay, Joe has a lot of accomplishments, but he's not, but there's still those buts. Right. But. But the bottom line is the alternative is Donald Trump, who might be one of the most monstrous people to ever assume the presidency, who might be the worst president we've ever had, and who probably would be even worse in a second term. Are people going to say, given that evil that's likely to result from a Trump presidency, Biden, we have to vote for Biden. We have to hold our nose and vote for Biden at the end. Do you see that is that the bottom line of this election, that people are going to have to just vote for the lesser of two evils in November?
I think so, and again, because it's a binary choice, you got to do that. And Trump is uniquely polarizing in American politics. You go back a long time, and there are people that love some politicians and other people that hate those same folks. Not to the extent that people feel that way about Donald Trump. And so, he's right. He's going to drive turnout on the Republican side, and he's going to drive turnout on the Democratic side in a way that we just aren't used to seeing. Particularly for somebody who's not currently in the office. For somebody that, yes, he's a former president, but he's been out for 4 years, and yet we're still recovering from the presidency.
Yes. I mean, we did it once, right? We did this in 2020, so can we do this again? Is I think the big question. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't address John's excellent point that we're kind of stuck with a binary choice, right? And that I think a lot of the other malaise that I hear out there, especially from younger folks, is the system is broken in their view, right? We have an electoral college, that the way that we get to the nomination process and how that party nomination piece works, they're pretty fed up with that, right? Because they did have this choice, some of them the first time they voted in 2020. And to see that again, and to see not a lot of attention to the systemic issues around how we even get to be candidates, that's a big issue for folks, and just makes them feel like, well, you know what, and we survived Trump once is something I hear out there all the time too, like, oh, the rest of the government will help us out. And so there's some very worrisome, I think, trends to think about on that. This is an imperfect union, and we really could use some candidates who want to think a little bit broader about how we get elected and what that process looks like, from campaign finance reform to the electoral college to all of it. And we don't see any energy around that in either party, frankly, right?
So let's talk a little bit more about the electoral map, because I mean, when Trump won in 2016, he didn't win the popular vote. I mean, Hillary Clinton got 3 million plus more votes than Trump did. And if Trump wins again this time, it would be, again, I would venture to say he's probably not going to win the popular vote, but he could still win the election. And which is sort of infuriating that the person that gets the most votes doesn't win, but that's our system, right? So how does the electoral map play out here? Does that mean both candidates have to spend all their time in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia,
Nevada, Arizona, that's it.
Is that it?
That's what's happening.
Is that where the election is?
That's exactly where the election is. And for us in Michigan, it means that we matter, and that the issues that concern people in Michigan are going to matter in this election. But that's absolutely the consequence of a country that's basically 50-50 in terms of support for Republicans and Democrats. But those 50% of voters for either party are not kind of evenly spread out across the entire country. And so we've got states that are going to vote overwhelmingly for Republican candidates. We've got other states that are going to vote overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates. And they're basically going to balance each other out. And those states that are up for grabs, where either party's candidates could potentially win, those are the states where all the action is going to be. And so for us in Michigan, that means people are going to pay attention. For folks in a lot of other states, that means that they're largely going to be ignored. It doesn't mean that their votes don't matter, but it means in terms of the way that the campaigns operate, the campaigns are going to be focused on the toss-up states, the purple states, if we sort of think about Republican states as being red and Democratic states as being blue. Those purple states are the ones that are going to see all of the campaign action.
And we're already seeing that from the national and international groups who want to work on climate. They are working in those 8 states, and that is it, right? And so the students who watch this on Monday, there's money out there. Come work on voter and climate campaigns this year, and try to get some of this message out, because everybody wants a piece of Michigan.
Say a little bit more about that. There's money out there. Do you mean there's people that could get employed to work on these campaigns over this next stretch here in Michigan? There are just a variety of national groups that are
trying to descend on Michigan to do exactly what John is saying. What are the issues? How do we drive that turnout in this state to make that happen? And so you've got the conservative ballot initiative, right, is definitely on that side. And we've got climate and economic other pieces, reproductive rights, those other pieces on the other side of the spectrum. And we're going to see a lot of groups and a lot of activity in this state.
Well, another hot button issue is gun violence and gun safety versus Second Amendment rights. And we have, two candidates who feel strongly about that. What impact will that have on voters?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in 2024, it's hard to separate gun violence from violence more generally in the minds of an awful lot of voters. Interesting in American politics, the National Rifle Association, which for so long was the sort of icon of the gun rights movement, is pretty much self-destructed. I mean, as an entity, the NRA is not powerful at all. And yet they were so successful in their messaging that they don't need to be a viable organization in politics anymore, because their message is going to outlive the organization itself. You can contrast that with all of the communities that have been damaged by gun violence, and the inability of our political leaders to find any sort of way, not any sort of way, to make really consequential changes in the impact of gun violence and the likelihood of gun violence. Because it is the case that there has been incremental movement in a number of places, including here in Michigan. But we're not seeing the dramatic changes that so many people would like to see, particularly those folks who have been the victims of or had family members be the victims of gun violence in their communities.
A big issue is immigration, right? And this is something, and we were talking about people showing that Biden showing that he's on people's side, on progressive side. But when I look at the bill that the Senate has approved, where he's going to make it much more difficult for people to claim asylum and to get asylum, that's a compromise which I think is going to really alienate a lot of people that want more progressive stance on immigration.
I think that's true. I'm not sure that in a policy sense, Congress is going to move in a more progressive way on immigration. And Republicans certainly see it as an issue that works for them, to the point that they were willing to kill the bipartisan compromise because they'd rather have the problem than solve the problem. They'd rather have the problem as a campaign issue than use government to try and solve the problem. That's not the way we've traditionally thought about the role of government in the United States, right? We can have disagreements about things, but at the end of the day, we ought to be working to make the lives of people better. We ought to be working on solving problems. And I think one of the things that a lot of voters in Michigan probably don't know, in the United States House of Representatives, there's a caucus called the Problem Solvers Caucus. Bipartisan, of course you folks know, but most voters don't. More than half of the Michigan delegation, members of both parties, are part of the Problem Solvers Caucus. There are 40 to 50 members across the nation that are part of the Problem Solvers Caucus. So voters in Michigan are electing people who are interested in solving problems. That isn't necessarily the case in the rest of the country. And the immigration issue, how do you forge bipartisan consensus? Well, sometimes you got to give something to get something, right? And so this is a great example of that there were lots of issues that were kind of put together to come up with something that members of both parties could agree on. In the Senate, that's one thing. In the House, it's not even going to get a vote. And the reason it's not even going to get a vote is because
they don't want
Donald Trump says, I want to campaign on this issue. I want the border to be as bad as possible in November. What can we do to make that situation look even worse than it does now? Because that's going to help me win election. And once I win election, then we don't have to worry about it because, of course, we don't have to worry about it.
Don, do you think that even though that's not a bill you or I would have come up with, right? What Biden's administration did. But did that still help blunt the issue more generally? Because now Joe can say, well, we were going to solve the problem. We had a solution, and you guys were the ones that rejected it. And you rejected it because Trump told you to, and that was irresponsible on his part. We were ready to move on this and do something. Do you think that allows him to at least blunt the issue as something that could actively hurt?
I do, and there are some positive things in there that the progressives would agree with too. But I do think that he's really does have a positive stand on that, saying, hey, look, I tried to solve this thing. I made some compromises, which I didn't want to make, but I wanted to solve the problem. And this guy doesn't want to solve the problem. I do think that's an important thing.
Do you guys see that working?
And that, to go back to the point we made before, that's how Joe Biden approaches politics. Not what would we love to have that we're never going to get? Let's only talk about that. But rather, what do we want to do? What do you want to do? How can we figure out a way to accomplish as much as we can that's going to have the greatest impact on solving the problem that we all agree is a problem? Now, immigration is such a complicated problem because it's so multifaceted. But this piece of legislation had an awful lot in it. And again, nobody thought that everything in it was taken directly from their wish list. But for Republicans, there was an awful lot of the stuff that they've been talking about that found its way into that bill. And yet, they're not willing to support it for political reasons, not for governmental reasons, not for solving problem reasons, but rather because we got an election coming up, and that's the most important thing.
Denise, the border issue, immigration is a huge issue, but it's also a climate issue.
Right.
So let's tie it to the climate. And how do we get that message out? Because I don't think very many people see it that way.
I don't think very many people see it that way, and it's immigration, right, is a problem. At least it's a problem that's recognized by all the parties. Right. The climate and environment is still so different, where you don't have an ability to have a conversation across the aisle, and it's because of these we get these large thread issues where, of course, most of the migration right now is because of droughts in Central and Middle America. If you're not able to produce food, folks aren't coming here just because they want to come here, right? No one puts their kids on their back and tries to walk here. That's just ridiculous. And so we really have to think about how we're systemically dealing with issues around the world that we are causing, frankly. And so without that problem identification getting into the immigration debate at all, we're really, a lot of folks on the left say, well, why would we do anything at the border if we're not doing these other pieces? And so those are the things that they want to see. And I totally agree, we do have a choice to make between whether we want to be problem solvers and work together. And we always hear folks say, I want bipartisan, so I want folks to work together. And that's just not really how it's been working out. We're so hyper partisan right now that it is a winner takes all approach. And I think that even over the last couple presidential election cycles, that has just increased even more, because folks see, well, gosh, if I can get the trifecta, and then I can push all of these pieces through, and what we know from that is that's not very durable, right? And it's not long-standing pieces, because then we get into the seesaw of politics. But immigration is one of those that we really could, I think, bring in a lot of other players and get to some better and farther down the road solutions if we were to talk about the reasons why migrants are coming here.
It's not there.
It's not in there.
It's just like they're just showing up is the footage you get. And, I think most reasonable people could think for a second and say, well, why? Right? What is happening there? And there we do have a huge role to play in not just solving the climate crisis, but in the humanitarian aid. It's very similar, right? In that way to the Gaza situation, and what are we really able to do as the world leader in being able to help folks, right?
And the crime issue is the big issue that the Republicans want to push, right?
That's right.
I mean, immigration has become a crime issue because these people are coming. They're not good people. They're going to commit all these crimes. The evidence doesn't support that at all.
No,
the criminological evidence shows completely the opposite.
That's right.
That there's less crime caused by immigrants than native-born, and it's not nothing that the Republicans say about the issue with regard to crime is true. I mean, you can pick out that an incident here and there, and of course you could do that for any group, right?
That's right.
But generally, the criminological evidence doesn't support anything that the Republicans say about this issue. But that's not getting across
No,
either.
it's not.
The climate connection, the crime issue, none of those things get through,
That's right.
it seems, in the campaign.
And the economy. There are a lot of people who seem to think that immigration is a threat to
Right.
to
That's
the
right.
nation's economy. And in fact, economists say it's the exact opposite there as well.
Yeah.
That's
That immigration is an economic driver rather than an economic drag.
Yeah.
Smart people know these things. College professors aren't always the best at sort of articulating these in a general way to an audience. But that reflects how complicated these kinds of policies are. We like simple solutions,
Yeah.
but if they're simple solutions to complex policies, they're probably not going to be very good
Right.
solutions.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. That's.
Should we talk about the role of the media? I mean,
As we're at Public Media Network, I don't know.
we're at a public media network, which
Thank you for
tries
hosting
to
us.
enlarge the discussion. But let's talk about the mainstream media and their coverage of the election, both in terms of just the horse race element, and then it seems to me, the utter lack of providing people with the appropriate political and social context of the issues that are going to be the most important issues
Yeah.
in the election.
Yeah.
So not every news organization has the opportunity to sit around a table for an hour and talk about a lot of things in depth, right?
Right.
And so how do you package...
We got to cut to commercial. Sorry.
So I think that folks in the mainstream media have tried to learn
Yeah.
how to best cover Donald Trump as a candidate and as a former president. What do you do if you know that so much of what he says isn't true?
Yeah.
Right.
Then you've got another huge swath of potential voters in the United States who are getting the exact opposite message.
Yeah.
That everything that Donald Trump says shouldn't be questioned, is unquestionable. It's what the other side says that needs to be questioned. And so, it's been a long time since, if you wanted to find out what was going on in the world, you watched one of 3 national networks while you ate dinner, right? Everybody got the same basic message, everybody got the same coverage of the same issues. There's a whole lot of reasons that's not helpful, but there are a whole lot of other ways where that is helpful, and the kind of fragmentation of the media that we see now doesn't necessarily do us a service when it comes to trying to talk to people who don't agree with us, because they have a completely different factual basis from which they're making decisions. Maybe I should use finger quotes when I say factual. They have a completely different basis from which they're making decisions. And so the mainstream media is going to continue, I think, to struggle with that, because their models of doing news assume that the people that they're covering are well-intentioned and reasonably honest, and so on and so on. And if that's not the case, then the models don't work.
Right.
And for the 2 years that Donald Trump was a candidate prior to the 2016 election, and for the 4 years of the Trump presidency, they didn't figure it out. They were trying to figure it out, but they were trying to figure it out in real time.
Yeah.
We might see some different coverage of him now from those news networks and from the mainstream media more generally, but that's not the audience that his campaign is focused on.
No, not at all. Yeah, I remember an influencer that I watch, on social media, said that they were invited to the White House to watch the State of the Union, and that Biden was very intentional in inviting 50 people there who were influencers, and said to them, the people in this room, your audience is larger than the big 3 networks.
Wow.
And so you need to get the message out, because that's how we're going to get the information to people who need to have it. It's not the mainstream media anymore.
Yeah. That's
And,
right.
and I think it's especially important for young people. We've been talking about before. I mean, I asked my class, how many of you guys watch the news one day? Nobody.
Nobody.
None of them.
Who reads a newspaper? Nobody.
Yeah.
Where do you get it? TikTok.
Yeah, exactly.
I know,
Okay.
we can't, I try not to decry that, but
Right.
it's so with everything that's going on with TikTok right now, it's been so interesting, the reports of the flood of input. I mean,
Yes.
this might actually be what gets this next generation civically engaged, okay? Because 8-year-olds are calling their congressperson to say, do not take away my TikTok. And right, but hey, if an issue speaks to you,
Right.
I feel
Right.
like we should use that moment and
Good
and
point.
think about that. But a lot of the folks that I talk to about this with social media is, the idea of the balanced news is still there. Like it's this tension between, well, we got to have the other, we got to present both sides, whatever that is, and that's just a myth. And in a partisan world, then your choices get pretty limited on how you're gonna do that. And most of these services have really gone to a subscription basis. Is I think what any media scholar will tell you is the underlying issue, right? Because it really all is click to pay to this. And how do you, it's always been headlines, right? How do you sell more newspapers? And it's just in a different format of social media and TikTok and these pieces. But I have to say I'm rather encouraged at the very young people who are know to call their congressperson about TikTok at least. Like we can work with that.
Do the campaigns have to, and I'm sure they are, they've got young people working for them in the campaign who know about
That's
this
why I
issue.
say there is a lot of folks who would like to invest in human resources in our state for you to make videos. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
One of the things that we've seen in campaigns generally is the pendulum swung from the most important part of your campaign was being able to go door to door, being able to hold events, in-person kinds of things. The pendulum swung to it's all on television. Now here in Michigan, we're still sort of in that television space. That's how we think about how campaigns should be run, is we just watch television and see the ads. But the fact of the matter is fewer and fewer people are there to be persuaded by those ads because you can't advertise on television if people aren't watching television.
Right.
Instead, you can micro-target, but that's a whole different thing, right? You're focused on the people that already support you to a large measure. We're seeing that pendulum swing back to boots on the ground, shoe leather, going door to door, holding events, having that personal interaction. Again, in Michigan, we're kind of behind the times on that, but that's the direction that campaigns seem to be moving. That's not to say that these other things aren't still important, but that personal dimension of campaigning is really making a comeback in a lot of places in the country.
Well, I think the New Georgia Project is a great example of that. How they went door to door. They looked at the elections and saw, we're losing by this many votes, and we got that many people that aren't voting, and we're going out and get them. And that made a huge difference.
Yep.
That's right.
Yep.
So I saw something on Facebook the other day. It said, it's not one old guy versus another old guy. It's democracy versus fascism. What do you think of that message? I mean, there's been a lot of talk. Trump's going to be dictator on day one. He's a threat to democracy. How much do you think that Democrats, the Biden administration, needs to focus on that particular issue, which I think is a real concern?
I think it's a real concern, and I think Biden is focusing on the democracy piece. That's the big contrast, right? To draw with Trump. Unfortunately, I don't think it's an issue that's exciting a lot of voters, and that's
Not get that turnout. You guys talk about the turnout, right?
What have we been doing, John, in trying to teach people about democracy? I mean, because it is absolutely on the line, and if you go to, I've been to a Trump rally and to the MAGA piece, and the Christian nationalism piece is real, and you will hear folks get up and talk about, right, that dictator is fine, and because he says so. It's a very different mentality for a candidate about why I support, and it doesn't matter what he says or does. That should be very scary to all of us in America in this great experiment that we have devised, frankly. And I think it should be a bigger issue. I think Biden wants to run on it, but I don't see folks out there.
Doesn't resonate. No.
And the other thing is there's the level of false equivalency that we see.
Yes.
So that, Donald Trump and his supporters talk about the Biden crime family.
Right.
Compared to what, right? Joe Biden is a dictator. Compared to what?
Right.
But it has the effect of neutralizing those issues. And those are complicated issues, right? Those are not the kinds of issues that most folks are talking about as they sit around the kitchen table. They're focused on their personal finances and the local economy and their perceptions of the economy. They're focused on violence in their communities. They're focused on all of these things that are important issues. But if we don't have a democracy, imperfect as it may be,
That's right.
then those things all fade away.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a huge concern.
Yeah.
A number of years ago, I was invited to give a talk to the Western Michigan Emeriti Council at their big dinner. It was, I think it was 2012. The election was going on, so my talk was on whether this was the most important election of your lifetime. I talked about to a bunch of retired faculty, and in 2012 I said no, it's not, and I sort of used some criteria and laid it all out. And afterwards, somebody came up and said, "Oh, you know, how can I motivate myself to go out and campaign, and why does it even matter?" And Mary Brown was there and put her hand on his arm and said, "It's the most important election this year."
That's right. Yeah.
This one's different. It is both the most important election this year, and it may be the most important election in most of our lifetime.
That's for sure.
That's the big deal.
Right.
That's right.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. My list was long. We had many more issues we could have gotten to, but we're not going to get there today. Thank you, John, for being here. Always great to have your insight. Denise, wonderful to see you back here again.
Always.
And thanks to Don and Regina.
Thank you.
We want to let you know that the Climate Emergency Spring into Action 2024 series is still going on. There are many other events to round out the series the rest of this month in March and in April. You can go online, the Kalamazoo WMU Climate Change Working Group, Climate Emergency Series, Spring into Action. Find out all the things that are going on. There's going to be a march and a rally on April 19th. So please, hopefully you will be able to participate in that. But we invite you to check out the series and all the different events that are going on, and please attend what you would like to attend. Again, thanks to all of you, and thank you for joining us on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.